19 days of white sun and cinder smoke, of trains that came screaming out of the east and left without her, of a station agent who told her the same lie every morning in the same flat voice. She had one wooden crate, one cloth bundle, and a folded paper wrapped in oilcloth that she wouldn't let anybody's hands touch but her own. Every man in Bowie Station saw her. Nobody stopped. I saw her more than most because my freight route ran past that platform twice a week, and because I'm the kind of man who writes down what he sees, weights, distances, the number of things. I put her in my tally book the way I put down sacks of flour. One woman, one crate, day 9. I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself that for a long time. What I didn't know, what took me 19 days and a dead man's signature to find out, was what she was waiting for. And when I finally understood it, I did a thing I've never been able to square with the law, or with God, or with the ledger I keep in my coat pocket where the numbers are supposed to add up. This is the story of the woman on the crate. And this is the story of the morning I finally rode in for her. The train didn't stop for her. It never did, but she stood up for it anyway, every time. I watched her do it that afternoon in May from across the tracks with my mules blowing and stamping in the heat. The westbound came howling in out of the desert, and she rose off that crate like a woman getting up in church, and she smoothed her skirt down with both hands, and she waited. The engine took on water. Men got off and men got on. A drummer in a checked suit spat and looked at her and looked away. The conductor swung up on the step and hollered something to the brakeman, and the whole iron mess of it groaned and pulled and went west into the shimmer, and the sound of it hung in the air a while after it was gone, the way sounds do out there. She sat back down on the crate. She did that 4 times a day, I counted. I count things, it's a habit I picked up hauling freight, where a man who can't hold numbers in his head gets cheated by the pound, and it's a habit that got worse in me over the years until it stopped being useful and started being something else. I've got a tally book I keep in my left coat pocket, oilcloth cover, string tied around it. In it there's 12 years of weights and distances and prices, 240 pounds of nails, 940 of flour. 18 miles to Croton Springs, 26 back if you swing wide of the Sowell place, because Wade Sowell will talk your ear off about water rights, and you'll lose an hour. I write things down. It's how I keep the world from getting away from me. That day at the bottom of a page of freight charges I wrote, Woman at Depot, day 9, 1 crate. I didn't know why I wrote it. I want to be honest about that, because if I make myself out to be a man with a soft heart from the start, then everything after gets easier than it was, and it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy at all. I wrote it because I wanted the number. Her crate said ARBUCKLES coffee on the side in red letters gone pink from the sun. Somebody had knocked out the top slats and put a scrap of army blanket over the raw edges so it wouldn't tear her skirt. Small thing. Somebody's kindness or her own. She had a cloth bundle tied with a rawhide string, and inside that bundle, I learned later, everything she had left in this world, which came to a tin cup, a bone awl, a woman's knife with a handle wrapped in wire, a needle case, a hairbrush made of grass bound tight at one end, 3 coins, and a pair of child's moccasins about 8 inches long with the beadwork worn down to nothing across the toe. She wore a calico skirt, faded blue, and a blouse that had been mended so many times at the elbow that the mending was the fabric now. She kept her hair back. She kept her hands folded when she wasn't working, and she was almost always working, sewing or braiding or turning a piece of tin into something with the patience of water on stone. She sat with her back to the depot wall in the morning for the shade, and she moved around to the freight side in the afternoon when the shade moved, and at night she slept sitting up against that crate with the blanket over her. 19 days. Purdy Voss was the station agent, little sawed-off fellow, green eyeshade, sleeve garters, a mustache he was too proud of. Every morning she'd go to his window and say something to him, always the same short thing, I could tell by the shape of it, and every morning Purdy would say, "Not yet. No hey Tren. Next week." He said it in 3 languages, none of them well, and then he'd look back down at his manifests like she'd been a fly. I asked him about her, maybe day 11, while he was signing off my bills. "Apache," he said, like that was the whole answer. "I can see that." "Then you can see why I don't want her sitting on my platform." He stamped something hard. "Bad for business. Fellow from the land office asked me, was this a reservation now? She waiting on somebody. She's waiting on a train that ain't coming." He looked up at me then, and there was a flicker of something in his face, not shame exactly, but the neighbor of it. She's got a paper, won't let go of it, won't let me hold it. Just holds it up at the glass like I'm supposed to read it through the window from 6 feet off. Did you read it? I got a railroad to run. I put my pencil in my book, and I put the book in my pocket, and I said, "Ain't much of a railroad, Purdy. It's a water stop." He didn't like that. I hauled my freight and went home. My name's Elias Trant. I run 140 head on ground that God clearly intended for lizards, and I freight to make up the difference, which is most of it. I'm 46 years old that spring. Widower, if you want the word. Ruth died of a fever in '81, and there's a place inside a man where a thing like that sits and doesn't move, and I'm not going to pick at it here. I've got one hired man, Tiburcio Rios, who's been with me 9 years and thinks I'm a fool about 80% of the time and is right about 60. And I've got a neighbor, Wade Sowell, who is the loudest human being in Cochise County and possibly the territory. And I've got a page in my tally book from 1871 that I have never been able to tear out. I'll get to that. Day 12 it rained. Not the good rain, the mean kind that comes early in the season, blows in sideways for 20 minutes and quits, having accomplished nothing but mud. I was at the depot loading barbed wire, cursing it, because barbed wire in the wet is a special kind of enemy. The woman had pulled her crate under the eave and had her blanket up over her head and shoulders, and she'd made a kind of tent of it, and inside that tent she was doing something with her hands. Della Comstock came across from the store with bread. Della ran the store with her brother and had opinions about most things and hair the color of a rusty pump handle. She set the bread down on the corner of the crate and said, loud and slow the way people do, "Bread. For you." The woman looked at the bread. Then she looked up at Della. And she said in English clear as a bell, "Thank you." Della's mouth came open a half-inch. She stood there. Then she said, "Well, you're welcome, I'm sure," and went back across the street walking faster than she'd come. I laughed. I couldn't help it. It came out of me short and surprised, and the woman heard it, and she turned her head and looked at me across 20 feet of wet platform. She had a face like a closed door, but her eyes went over me the way a horse buyers do, legs, hands, boots, the mules, the load, back to the face, reading me, pricing me, and whatever the price came to she didn't say, she just went back to her hands. That was the first time she ever looked at me. That night I wrote in the book, Day 12, rain 1 4-inch abt. She speaks English. And underneath, because it was true, and because nobody reads my book but me. I laughed and she saw me laugh, and I felt like a dog. Day 15, Wade Sowell came to my place about a bull that had gotten through his fence and made himself popular among Wade's heifers. And after we'd settled that, he leaned on his saddle horn and said, "You see that squaw down at the station?" "I've seen a woman down at the station." 19 days. 15. He squinted at me. "You counting?" "I count everything, Wade, you know that." He shifted. Wade Sowell had lost a cousin in '82 and had been telling everyone about it every year since, which is a thing I understood better than I let on. "Well, somebody ought to move her along." "Where to?" "That ain't the point." "It's exactly the point," I said. "You want her moved, fine, moved where Wade say the place." He didn't have a place. Nobody ever has a place. They just want the thing out of their eye. He rode off mad. Tiburcio came out of the barn with a bridle over his shoulder and watched him go and said, "You made a friend." "I've got too many as it is." "Cierdo," he set the bridle down, then casual, not looking at me. "The woman at the station." "What about her?" "My cousin's wife saw her. Says she was at the fort. Says she washed for the officers before." "Before what?" Tiburcio looked at me, then like I'd asked what water was. "Before the trains, Elias. You have to understand what the trains meant that year in that country. The September before, they'd loaded the Chiricahua at Bowie Station, the whole people, or near enough, men and women and children, into cars and sent them east. Florida first. Then other places, not just the ones who'd been out with Geronimo, the scouts too. The ones who'd ridden with our soldiers, who'd tracked for us, who'd been paid in Army script and given brass tags and told they were on our side. They were put on the same cars as everybody else. Some of them still had their enlistment papers in their shirts. I wasn't there when they loaded. I've been grateful for that in a small, cowardly way ever since. but men who were there talked about it in the saloon for months. About the singing, about how the cars had no water, about a soldier who broke down and had to be walked away. And afterward there were the leftovers, always are, the ones who'd been off working a ranch that week, the ones in a jail somewhere on a drunk charge, the ones in service to a captain's wife in Tucson, the ones nobody could find at the time and nobody knew what to do with after. They drifted around the territory that year like ash after a fire, and there was no law that fit them and no place they were allowed to be. She was one of those. Day 17, I finally spoke to her. I'd like to say I planned it. What actually happened is I had a broken hame strap and 40 minutes to kill, and I was standing on the platform being useless, and she was sitting on her crate stitching a tear in that blanket with the bone awl and a piece of sinew. I said, "That's good work." She didn't stop stitching. I said, "I've got a saddle blanket you could practice your bad work on, if you ever wanted a job." "Nothing." I said, "All right," and turned to go, and behind me she said, "Do you go east?" I turned back around. Her voice was low and level, and she still hadn't looked up. "East where?" "East," she pulled the sinew through. "On the road, with the wagon, do you go east?" "I go to Croton Springs and San Simon. That's east." "It's about as east as I go." "Not far enough," she said, and that was the end of it. She kept stitching. I stood there a second, feeling the way a man feels when he's been weighed and come up short. Then I said, and I don't know why, except that a thing had been sitting in my chest for 17 days, and it picked that moment to come out. "What are you waiting for?" Her hands stopped. She looked up. She had a scar through her left eyebrow, thin and old and white. Her eyes were red-rimmed from 19 days of cinder smoke and sun, and no shade worth the name. "A train," she said. "There's 4 a day." "Not mind." "Ma'am, they said a train would come." She said it flat, and even the way you say a thing you have said many times and been laughed at for. "In the winter at the fort, the officer wrote it. He wrote it on a paper. He said you will go on a train to where they are when the order comes. He wrote the paper with his own hand, and he gave it to me, and he said, 'Keep this.'" She touched her breast, where the oilcloth packet sat under the blouse. "I keep it. I come here, I wait for the train." "How long you been waiting?" "Since the moon was small." A pause. 2 moons before that I waited at the fort. They put me out of the fort." "Who's they at the other end? Where they are, who's they?" And that was when the door in her face opened about an inch, and I got my first look at what was behind it, and I wished I hadn't asked. "My son," she said. His name in their language she told me later, and I'm not going to put it down here wrong. On the paper he was Thomas. Thomas Cloud, the school named him, which is a name a clerk makes up in about 4 seconds while a 9-year-old boy stands in front of him with his hair being cut off. He'd been taken in the fall, not with the big shipment, after in a smaller one, children mostly, gathered up from wherever they'd landed and put on a car to a school back east in Pennsylvania, where they'd be made into something the government could file. She'd been in service at the fort, washing, when they came for the children. She was 200 yards away with her arms in a tub of gray water, and she heard the wagon, and by the time she got to the road, the wagon was at the turn. She ran after it 1.5 miles. She told me that part with no more heat than a man reading a bill of lading. 1.5 miles. Then she said, "I could not run more," and looked at her hands, and I understood that of everything that had happened to her, that was the thing she couldn't forgive, and it was the one thing in it that wasn't anybody's fault but her body's. The officer, a lieutenant, she said his name, and I wrote it down as best I could hear it, had been decent. Whether out of guilt or Christian feeling or just because he was young enough to still think a signature meant something, he'd written her a paper. Authorization to travel east in company to the place where the prisoners were held, upon issuance of the order. Upon issuance of the order. 4 words. A man can build a whole life on 4 words, and never once look at them closely. "May I see the paper?" I said. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she took it out under the blouse on a thong and unwrapped the oilcloth, and there it was, folded so many times the creases had gone furry. The ink faded at the folds to almost nothing. She didn't hand it to me. She held it up in both hands the way Purdy said she did, 6 feet away, so I had to lean in and squint. I read it twice. Then I read the date and the signature a 3rd time, and something went cold and slow down the back of my neck, and I stood up straight. "Ma'am," I said, "where'd you say the lieutenant is now?" "He went east on the train. With them. And you never heard from him after?" "He said the order would come." I looked at the platform boards. I looked at the crate. I looked at 19 days. "All right," I said. It took me 4 days to run it down, and I did it in the worst way possible, which is to say honestly, going from one man to the next asking questions in daylight. Here's what I learned. The lieutenant who signed her paper had died in November. Yellow fever at St. Augustine, along with a good many of the prisoners he'd escorted, who had been marched out of a desert and locked in a stone fort on a swamp coast and started dying almost immediately, which anybody who'd ever been to both places could have told you would happen. The order he'd promised had never been issued, because the man who was to issue it had no idea it had been promised, because the promise had been made in pencil on a Tuesday afternoon by a 26-year-old who thought he'd be alive to keep it. And the boy, Thomas Cloud, was not with the prisoners at all. The prisoners were in Florida and then Alabama. The children were at the school in Pennsylvania, 1,000 miles from any of them. So even if the order had come, even if the train she was waiting for had pulled into Bowie Station with her name on a ticket, it would have carried her to a stockade full of her people where her son was not, and would never be, and she'd have arrived to find that out standing on a platform with a crate. That's what I had in my hands on the 21st of May. I sat on the tailgate of my wagon out behind the corral for a long time with my tally book open on my knee and nothing written in it. Now I have to tell about the page from 1871, because otherwise the next part of this doesn't make sense, and because I've carried it long enough that setting it down might do me some good. In April of that year, I was 29 and hauling for a party out of Tucson. I wasn't a soldier. I want that clear, and I also want it clear that it doesn't matter, and I know it doesn't matter, and I've known it for a long time. There was a camp up a wash. There was a dawn. I stayed with the wagons and the animals, which is what a teamster does, and I heard it, and I did not go up, and afterward I went up. I was the one who counted. Not because anybody asked me to. Because that is what I do when I don't know what else to do with myself. I count, I write it down, I make the world into a number so it will sit still and stop moving around inside me. I wrote the number in my book. It's still there. Page 31 in a hand I can barely recognize as mine. There's no word next to it. Just the number, and below it in the same pencil, a line I wrote later that night and have never been able to read straight through without stopping. Most of them were not men. I have kept a tally book for 12 years since. I have filled 6 of them, and I have never once been able to throw away the first. So when you ask me why a middle-aged freighter with no politics and no religion and no business in it did what he did that May, I tell you, don't make it noble. It wasn't. There's a ledger inside me that doesn't balance and never will. And for 19 days there'd been a woman sitting on a coffee crate on the Bowie Station platform, and I could see her from the road. And every time I drove past her, the number on page 31 got a little louder. That's all it was, a man trying to make a column add up. It's a poor reason. It was the only one I had. Day 20, Purdy Voss did the thing that decided it. There was an inspector coming through, a division man out from Tucson, the kind who walks a platform with his hands behind his back and looks at the paint. And Purdy had been told to have his station presentable. I came in around 11 with a load of lumber, and I heard it before I saw it. 2 men from the section gang had a hold of the crate. She was standing. Not fighting, she had a hand on the crate's edge. That was all one hand, and she was talking to Purdy, fast and low, and Purdy had his eyeshade pushed up and his face was the color of a brick, and he was saying, "It's not mine to say. It's not mine to say," over and over like a man throwing water on a house that's already gone. They pulled the crate away from her. It wasn't a big pull, it didn't need to be. The bottom slats had rotted where the rain got in, and when they swung it around, the crate came apart. Everything she owned went across the platform boards. The tin cup rolled. It rolled a long way, ringing, and went off the edge and into the cinders. The needle case burst. The 3 coins spun and lay down, and the little pair of moccasins came out and landed in the wet spot under the water barrel, toes down, one on top of the other, the way children leave them. She went to her knees. Not dramatic, just down fast, hands out, gathering. The section men stood back and looked at their boots. Purdy said something. The inspector's train whistled somewhere out east. I was standing by my mules with the lead line in my hand. And I want to tell you I moved. I want to tell you I crossed that platform in 4 steps. I stood there. God help me, I stood there and watched a woman on her knees in the cinders picking up a needle case. And I did the arithmetic. 140 head, the freight contract. The fact that whatever she was a prisoner of war under the United States Army, and a man who took her in was a man committing a federal crime with witnesses. And Wade Sowell 4 miles off, and Purdy watching. I did the arithmetic, and I got in my wagon and I drove home. That's the truth. I'm 61 years old writing this, and it's still the truth, and it doesn't get better with age. I didn't sleep. I lay in the dark listening to the windmill and doing what I always do, which is count head of cattle, dollars owed, days till the note came due, miles to San Simon. I got all the way through my whole life in numbers, and none of them helped. And around 2 in the morning, I got up and lit the lamp and took out the tally book and turned to page 31. 21 years, and I still couldn't look at it for more than a second. I turned to a fresh page and I wrote, Day 20, crate broke. She went down on her knees for a needle case and I drove home. I looked at that sentence for a long time. Then I wrote underneath it, I have been keeping account of another man's crimes my whole life, so I would not have to keep one of my own. And I closed the book and I sat there in the lamplight with my hands flat on the table, and I'm not a praying man and I didn't pray. I just sat. Tiburcio came in at 4 to start the coffee and found me dressed and hitching the good mules to the light wagon in the dark. And he stood in the doorway with his blanket around his shoulders and said, Where do you go? Bowie. You went to Bowie yesterday. I know it. He didn't move. The lantern was on the ground between us and it put his face half in shadow. He's a smart man, Tiburcio, and he'd been watching me for 19 days the same way I'd been watching her. They will say you are hiding her, he said. I know. Sowell will say it first. I know that too. He was quiet, then he said, Take the canvas. It will be hot by 10 and there is no shade at that station. There has been no shade at that station for 2 months. He'd been counting too. It was maybe 6:40 when I came up on the depot with the sun still low and orange, and the whole country lying flat and pink, and cool for the 1 hour a day it ever is. The platform was empty. I felt it drop out of me. I'd been holding a thing together all night with baling wire, and it came apart right there in the road, and I pulled the mules up short and stood in the wagon box like a fool, looking at nothing. Then I saw her. She was down past the end of the platform, off railroad property, sitting on the ground in the weeds by the section house fence with the broken crate stacked in pieces beside her and the bundle in her lap. She'd tied it back together with the rawhide and a strip off her own skirt. She was sitting very straight. She'd been moved along. And she had moved exactly 40 feet and stopped, and sat back down facing the tracks. 20 days, 240 trains, near enough, and she'd gotten up for everyone. I have thought about that woman's back a great deal in the years since. Straight as a fence post in the weeds at the end of a railroad platform in the Arizona Territory, waiting on a train that had never existed, put there by a promise from a dead man, and holding that promise in oilcloth against her skin, because it was the last thing anybody had given her that had her son's future in it. You can call that a lot of things. Some men would call it ignorance. Wade Sowell would. I've hauled freight for 30 years. I know what a load is, and I'll tell you that's the heaviest thing I ever saw one person carry. I drove down along the fence and got the mules stopped and set the brake and climbed down. She'd heard the wagon 100 yards off. She was watching me come. Her face was closed again, worse than closed, it was finished. It was the face of somebody who had already decided what I was going to be and was only waiting to be proved right. I stopped 6 feet off, and I took my hat off, which I hadn't planned, and I stood there holding it. Ma'am, I said, the order's not coming. She didn't move. The lieutenant that signed your paper died in November, in Florida, fever. I made myself keep going because if I stopped, I wasn't going to start again. There's no order. There was never going to be an order. He meant it when he wrote it. I believe that. But he's dead, and the man in his chair doesn't know your name, and nobody's ever going to send that train. The wind came up and moved the weeds and went off again. And your son's not with them, I said. He's not in Florida and he's not in Alabama. He's in Pennsylvania, at the school. I stopped. I'd been going to say it's a long way, and I heard how that would sound, and I let it go. Her hands in her lap closed slowly around the bundle. That was all. That was the whole of it. Her hands closed, and she looked past me at the tracks, and I watched 20 days and 2 months and 1.5 miles of running go out of a person's face all at once. I stood there in the weeds with my hat in my hands. And then, I swear this on whatever's left of me, she reached up and took the thong from around her neck and unwrapped the oilcloth and looked at that paper. Just looked at it, at the thing she'd guarded from every hand for 2 months, the dead boy's handwriting that she couldn't read a word of and had believed in like scripture. She started to fold it up again. Then she stopped and held it out to me and said, "Read it to me, all of it, the true words." So I did. Standing in the weeds at 7 in the morning, I read a dead lieutenant's promise out loud to a woman who had been sitting under it like a roof. And when I got to upon issuance of the order, she said, "Again." And I said it again, and she nodded once slow, the way you nod at a doctor. Then she folded it and put it back in the oilcloth and put it around her neck anyway. I said, "There's another way to get east." She looked at me. "It's not legal," I said. "Not one part of it. If it goes wrong, they'll put me in a federal jail and they'll put you somewhere worse. And I want you to hear that from me standing right here before you say anything, because I'm not going to be one more man who tells you a nice thing and then dies before he has to do it." The sun was full up now. It came flat across the desert and lit the side of her face and the white scar in her eyebrow and the dust on her, and she was, I think, about 35 years old. "Why," she said. And there it was. The only question that mattered, and she'd found it inside 4 seconds, and she asked it without any softness at all, because she'd had 2 months of men being soft at her through a window. I could have lied. I had a good one ready, Christian duty, common decency, the sort of thing that goes down easy. Because in 71 I counted the dead at a camp up a wash near the Aravaipa, I said, and I wrote the number in a book, and I have carried that book for 16 years, and I don't know how to put it down. The silence after that lasted a long time. She didn't absolve me. I want to say that plainly because a story like this wants her to, and she didn't, not then and not ever. She looked at me the way you look at a man who has just told you he is the same weather that flattened your house. Then she said, "That is a bad reason." "Yes, ma'am. It is about you, not about my son." "Yes, ma'am, it is." She stood up. It took her a moment. 20 days on the ground will do that to a person's knees. She put the bundle under her arm. She looked at the wagon and the mules and the water barrel I'd filled at 4 in the morning and the canvas Tiburcio had made me take. "But you came," she said. "I came late." "Yes," she started walking toward the wagon. "You came late." She got up on the wheel without help. She sat down on the board with her bundle in her lap and her back straight, and she looked east down the rails one more time, at the 2 bright lines going off into all that empty country toward wherever they'd taken him. Then she said, "Do not stop at the store. The woman there will want to say goodbye, and I have nothing to say to her." I got up beside her and took the lines off the brake. "Ma'am," I said, "I don't even know your name." She didn't answer that, not for 11 days. But I remember that she almost smiled, a 1/4 inch at one corner, gone before I was sure of it, and she said, "Drive." I left the pieces of the crate lying in the weeds by the section house fence. Purdy Voss told me later that they stayed there most of a year. Nobody wanted to be the one to haul them off. He said the inspector never even noticed them that day, walked right past, looked at the paint on the freight house door, said it wanted doing and got back on his train. That's how it goes. A thing can be the whole world to one person and be nothing at all to the man walking by, and there's no fixing that. There's only ever deciding which of the two you're going to be that morning. I made my decision at 4 a.m. in a lamplit kitchen with a tally book open in front of me. We made 9 miles the first day. That's a bad number. My mules will do 25 on a decent road with a light wagon, and the road to San Simon is as decent as anything in that country, and I had them hitched and watered, and the load was mostly canvas and beans. 9 miles. I stopped that early because at 2 in the afternoon I looked over at her and saw she'd gone the color of ash under the dust, and her hands were shaking on the bundle in her lap. And I realized that a person who has sat upright on a wooden crate for 20 days, sleeping sitting, eating what the Comstock woman remembered to bring, was not a person who could take a wagon board over washboard road for 8 hours. I pulled off into the mesquite along a dry wash and set the brake and said, "We're stopping." She said, "There is light left." "There is." "Then we go." "Ma'am, you're about to fall off this wagon, and if you fall off this wagon and break something, then everything I'm about to do to my life is for nothing, and I'd like to at least get value for it." She looked at me. Then she got down off the wheel, carefully, both hands, and walked 20 feet into the brush and stood there with her back to me for a while. And I unhitched and hobbled the mules and did not look in that direction. And when she came back, her face was washed and her hands were steady, and neither of us said anything about it. That was the first thing I learned about her. She would not be seen kneading. I wrote in the book that night by the fire. Day 19 me. E by se beans, coffee, bacon, 2 mules sound, water at Dos Palmas good. And under it. She has not eaten in front of me. Here is what I was up against, laid out plain, the way I laid it out for myself on that first night with the fire down to coals, and the whole Chiricahua Range standing black against the stars like a wall God built to keep people in. She was a prisoner of war. Not in the sense that anybody had ever put her in a cell. In the sense that the United States Army had, in September of the year before, declared an entire people to be prisoners. Every man, woman, and child of them, including the ones who'd scouted for us, including the ones who'd never fired a shot at anybody and shipped them east under guard, and the ones who got missed in the sweep did not thereby become free. They became unaccounted for. Which is a different thing entirely, and worse, because a free person has a place, and an unaccounted for person has only the space between the places where somebody might notice her. Any deputy in the territory could pick her up, any citizen could report her and get thanked for it. And any man traveling with her, feeding her, driving her, hiding her under a canvas in the back of a freight wagon, was interfering with the custody of the United States, and there were federal judges in Tucson who had opinions about that. That was the law of it. The money of it was worse. Bowie Station to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, is something over 2,000 miles. Immigrant class fare, which is what you take when you're pretending to be nobody, ran in those days about $30 a head if you were willing to change cars in Kansas City and sit up for 6 days. 60 for the two of us. Then meals. Then whatever it took to get a room in a town where a white man traveling with an Indian woman would be a subject of comment for the rest of the year. Call it $150 to do it right. I had $11.40 in the tin box under my floorboard, 140 head of cattle that were worth money in the fall and nothing in May, a note on my place with Hollister's Bank in Wilcox that came due in September, and a freight contract that would pay me $42 at the end of the month if I was there to haul the freight. I sat by that fire and did the arithmetic 3 separate ways and got the same answer every time, which was, sell the cattle. In May, at the bottom of the year, to a buyer who would know inside of 4 minutes that I had to sell. I wrote it down anyway because writing it down is how I make myself believe a thing. 140 HD, May price. Approx, 9/HD if lucky. $1,260, less commission, less the note less. And then I stopped and looked across the fire. She was sitting with her back against the wagon wheel and the bundle beside her and her head tipped back, and she was asleep sitting up, because after 20 days that was the only way her body knew how anymore. I put the pencil in the book and closed it. Day 3 we came through the flats below San Simon, and I made a mistake. I'd been keeping her in the wagon box under the canvas whenever the road had anything on it, and she'd taken to it without complaint, which is to say she'd climb back and lie down among the sacks and pull the canvas over and go so still that twice I looked back to make sure she was still there. But it was 104 degrees under that canvas at midday, and we were on a stretch with nothing on it but heat shimmer for 6 miles, and I said, "Come up front, get the air." She came up front, and 4 minutes later Wade Sowell came over the rise out of the north with 2 of his men and a string of horses, because Wade Sowell had bought ground at Croton Springs in March, and I had known that and had forgotten it, which is the kind of thing I do not forget, which tells you the shape my head was in. There was nowhere to go. There was not so much as a bush. Wade pulled up and pushed his hat back and looked at me and looked at her, and I watched his whole face rearrange itself. "Ilias," he said. "Wade." Well, he put both hands on his horn. Well. His two men had stopped a little behind him. One was a kid of about 19 with a bad sunburn. The other I didn't know. "Where you headed?" Wade said. "San Simon Freight." "That's a light load for freight." "It's a light month." He looked past me at her again. She was sitting with her hands in her lap and her eyes forward, absolutely still, the way a deer goes still, not frozen. Ready. I could feel it coming off her like heat off a stove. "That's the one from the depot," Wade said. "That's a woman riding on a wagon." "That is the one from the depot, Ilias. I know what I'm looking at." His voice went up. Wade's voice always went up. It was the least dangerous thing about him and the most annoying. "That is a Chiricahua Apache, and she is government property, and you have got her sitting on your seat in the broad open." "Government property?" I have heard a great many ugly things said in my life, and most of them slide off. That one went in like a splinter, and it is in there yet. And here is where I did the thing I have to write down. I laughed. I made myself laugh, a short one, the way you do at a man who's misread a brand, and I said, "Wade, she's Mexican." The silence went on about a half-second too long. "She's what?" said Wade. "She's Mexican. She's the widow of a fellow that worked for Rios' cousin over to Solomonville. She's been cooking for me since April. You want to look at her hands, look at her hands. She's got a cook's hands." I leaned back and put my boot up on the dash like a man with all day. "Now you saw a woman at the depot. I saw her too. Sat there 3 weeks, and if she's still there, they'll have to charge her rent. But that ain't this one, and if you want to ride 4 miles out of your way to squint at every dark-haired woman in the territory, Wade, you go on and do it, but I've got to be in San Simon." The kid with the sunburn was looking at the ground. The other man wasn't. Wade chewed on it. I could see him wanting it, wanting to be right, wanting the story he'd tell in Wilcox. And I could also see him doing the same arithmetic every man does, which is, what does it cost me to be wrong out loud in front of my hands? "She don't look Mexican," he said. "Wade," I said, "you couldn't tell a Mexican from a Methodist." The kid laughed. That did it. Wade said something about my bull and the fence and said it twice and turned his horse and they went. I sat there a good minute after they were out of hearing. Then I picked up the lines. And she said, without turning her head, "Cook's hands." I didn't answer. "You said look at her hands," still not turning, her voice absolutely flat. "You told him to look at my hands so he would see a servant." I told him a story he'd swallow. "Yes," a pause, "you are good at it." "Ma'am." "Do not," she said it quietly. "Do not say a soft thing now. It was the right thing. Drive." We went 4 miles without a word. And I want to be exact about this, because the shape of that afternoon has stayed with me. It was not that she was angry. She was not angry. She had simply watched a man erase her in order to save her, and she had understood immediately that this was the arrangement, that this was going to be the arrangement for the next 2,000 miles. And she had accepted it inside of about 3 seconds because she had already accepted worse. That's what I couldn't get past, not that I lied. That it cost her nothing to be told she was nobody, because it wasn't news. Wilcox, day 5. I left her with the wagon in a wash 2 miles north with the mules hobbled in a canteen and told her I'd be back by dark, and I rode in on the mare and sold my cattle. I won't drag it out. Cotton Beal bought them. He looked at me across his desk for about 10 seconds and then he named a price that was $3 ahead under the market, and I said yes, and he said, "You didn't even fight me," and I said, "No, I didn't," and he said, "Ilias, are you in trouble?" And there was something almost kind in it, and I said, "Cotton, write the draft." $1,140. Day 7, Tiburcio caught up with us. He came up the wash at dusk on my other mare with a pack behind the cantle, and he got down and looked at the camp and the fire and the woman and me, and he said, "You forgot the pack saddle and the shoeing hammer. And you took the wrong canteen, that one leaks at the seam. I have told you about that canteen for 2 years." Tiburcio. And Sowell has been in Wilcox telling everyone that Elias Trant is hiding an Apache. He unbuckled the pack. He tells it in the saloon. He tells it at the church. On Thursday, a man from the newspaper asked him to say it again slower. I sat down on the wagon tongue. "He's got no proof." He has a mouth in this country that is enough for a warrant if the judge is bored. He set the pack down. Then he crouched and put a stick on the fire and said, not looking up, I have sold my saddle. You did what? It was a good saddle, I have another. He shrugged one shoulder. $40, it is in the pack in the coffee tin. You will not argue with me about it because you have already sold everything you own. And a man who has sold everything he owns has no standing to lecture a man who has sold one saddle. I sat there. Tiburcio, if they take her, they'll take whoever's with her. Yes, that's a federal. Elias, he looked up. The firelight was on the side of his face. In 1863, the government of this territory paid money for the scalp of my grandmother's people. There is no law in this country that has ever been for me. So when you tell me federal, you are speaking a word to me that I do not hear the way you hear it. He put another stick on. Also, he said, you cannot cook. You would kill her before Texas. And that, I swear, was the first time I ever heard her laugh. It wasn't much. One short breath through the nose, and her hand went up over her mouth like she'd caught herself doing something foolish. But Tiburcio heard it, and he did not look at her, and he did not make anything of it, and I understood that he was better at this than I would ever be. He rode with us as far as the New Mexico line and then went back, because someone had to be at my place or there wouldn't be a place, and because we agreed he'd carry the letter. The letter. Day 8 in the evening, I got out paper and the good pencil and said, I'm going to write to the school. She was working on a snare. She'd been catching us rabbits since day 4, which is one reason I stopped worrying about food and started worrying about what else she knew how to do that I didn't. She didn't stop working. What will you say? I'll ask if he's there. I'll ask them to tell him his mother's coming. Her hand stopped. No, she said. Ma'am, do not tell him I am coming. She set the snare down. If you tell him and I do not come, then he will wait. He will stand at a window. Do you understand? He will stand at a window every day the way I sat on the box. Her jaw worked once. I will not do that to him. Ask if he is there, nothing else. So that's what I wrote. I have a copy of it because I copy everything, and it reads, to the Superintendent, Indian Industrial School, Carlisle, Penna. Sir, I write to inquire whether you have among your scholars a boy of the Chiricahua Apache, taken from Arizona Territory in the autumn of 1886, aged approx. 9 years, entered under the name Thomas Cloud. I ask only whether he is present and in health. Please direct your reply to E. Trant, care of Rios, Bowie Station, AT. I will be obliged. Your opt. Served, Elias Trant. I read it to her. In health, she repeated. Yes, ma'am. She looked at the fire a long time. Change it, she said. Ask if he is present, do not ask the other. Why? Because if they must answer the other, she said, they will have to think about it, and I do not want them thinking about him. I want them to look at a list. I have known men who ran cattle outfits with 200 hands who could not think that clearly. I struck the words out. Tiburcio took the letter south to Lordsburg to post, and it went off into the country the way letters do, and we drove east with the mountains falling away behind us, and neither of us said one word about it for 18 days. Day 11, she told me her name. We were camped in the Animas Valley with the fire small and a wind coming down out of the north that had no business being that cold in June. She'd been quiet all evening. She'd been quiet all week, really, but this was a different quiet, the kind with something loading up behind it. She said, at the fort they called me Mary. All right. Because of my son. They wrote him Cloud, so they wrote me Mary Cloud on the paper for the washing money. A pause. $6 a month, they wrote it in a book. I didn't say anything about books. That is not my name, she said. And then she said her name, and she said it twice so I'd hear it. And I got out my tally book and wrote it down the way I heard it, which was Na Du Sen. And I held it up and she looked at the page. She could not read one mark on it, and she said, that is not it either, but it is closer than Mary. I have been told since by a man who knows that I had it wrong in 2 places out of 3. I've never changed it. It's in the book that way, and it's staying that way, because that's how she gave it to me, and that's the only version of it I ever earned. Nadusen, I said, you say it like a man carrying something heavy up a hill. I generally am. The wind moved the fire around. She pulled her blanket up. His name is not Thomas, she said. You know this. I figured. I will not say his name to you. Very level. Not because you are bad, because I have said it to too many people who wrote it down and then it became a thing on a list, and every time it went on a list something worse happened. So I keep it now. It is mine and it is his and nobody's else. That's fair. It is not fair, she said. It is only what is left. I wrote that in the book too later, and there are nights I wish I hadn't. 2 days into the playas, the horseman came. We'd seen the dust for an hour off to the south, and I'd got the rifle up under the seat and told myself it was a rider going somewhere with no interest in us. And then at about 5 in the afternoon, he came out of a fold in the ground 400 yards off and sat there. Nadusan stood up in the wagon box. She stood up so fast the whole rig rocked, and I said her name and she wasn't listening. She was looking. And then she made a sound, not a word, a sound, one note, and she was down off that wagon before I could get the brakes set and running. He came in at a lope and got down, and they met in the middle of all that flat nothing. He was young, 20, maybe less. He wore a cotton shirt gone brown and a cartridge belt and a hat that had come off some dead somebody, and his horse was a good horse ridden thin, and he had 2 of them, the second on a lead, saddled and empty. He came down out of the Chiricahuas or the Pelinsillos or somewhere south of both. I never learned exactly. There were still people in those mountains that year, not many, a few families who never came in who went back and forth across the line into the Sierra Madre where the army couldn't follow and the Mexicans wouldn't. They were not an army anymore. They were people living in rock and not being caught. He was her sister's son. They talked for a long time. I stayed by the wagon with my hands where he could see them and the rifle where I couldn't reach it, which was the only sensible arrangement. The light went long and orange. Their voices came across the flat in pieces. Twice he raised his arm and pointed south. Twice. And I sat on that wagon seat and I understood exactly what was happening. And my stomach went down into my boots because I'd known it might and had somehow not let myself think it through. He had brought a horse. He had ridden God knows how many nights to find her, this woman his mother's sister, this one loose thread of his family that hadn't gone east on the cars. And he had brought a saddled horse, and he was pointing south at the mountains where there was no army and no reservation and no ration line and no agent, where a person could be a person. And he was saying, I'd bet everything I ever owned on this, and I own nothing by then. Come with me. Come home. There is still a home. It is small and it is hard, and it is in the rocks in Mexico, and nobody will ever find us, but come. She was 50 years from that country by then, in every way that mattered. But it was right there, 400 miles and a young man who knew the water. I could not hear what she said. I saw what she did. She reached into her blouse and took out the oilcloth packet. She unwrapped it. She held that useless paper up in the failing light, the dead lieutenant's promise. The thing I had told her 12 days ago was worth nothing, and she pointed east with it. He said something loud. First loud thing either of them had said. She said something back, 3 or 4 words, and put the paper away, and folded her hands. And he stood there. I have thought about that boy a lot, what it must have taken him to get there, what it must have cost him, coming down out of those rocks into open flat country where any rider could see him for 6 miles, to find one person and offer her the only thing he had, and to be told no, not by the army, by her. They stood facing each other in the last of the sun. Then she untied her bundle, right there in the dirt, and went into it and brought out the knife. The woman's knife, the good one with the wire-wrapped handle, the one I'd watched her skin 4 rabbits with, and she put it in his hands and closed his fingers over it. He didn't want it. He tried to give it back. She wouldn't take it. She put her palm flat on his chest and left it there a moment. Then she turned around and walked back to the wagon. She got up on the wheel. She sat down. She put her hands in her lap. He was still standing out there with the 2 horses and the knife. Ma'am, I said, if you want to go. I'll say I never saw you. There's no. Drive, she said. Nadusan. Drive. I drove. He followed us for 9 miles. Kept off a 1/4 mile to the south, just a shape and a smudge of dust, until the light was almost gone. Then the shape stopped, and stayed stopped and got smaller, and then there was only the country. She never turned around, not once. I watched her the whole time out of the side of my eye, and she never turned around, and her back was straight, and her hands didn't move in her lap, and it was full dark before I heard the first breath go out of her wrong. She cried without making any noise at all. I only knew because of the breathing. I did not say anything. There was nothing to say. There is a kind of grief a man has no business putting his hands on, and I had already learned that much about her. Around 10, I stopped and made a fire, and she got down and helped me, and we ate, and she said one sentence the whole night. He is the last one of my family that is free. And then, after maybe a minute, and I am going the other way. That's the thing I'd want understood, if I could get one thing across. Everybody who heard about this afterward, the few I ever told, everybody wanted it to be a story about a white man doing something. And it wasn't. My part in it was money and a wagon and a lie about a cook's hands. That's it. That's the whole of my contribution to the history of the thing. The decision was made by a woman in a wagon box in the Playas Valley in June of 1887, who had freedom sitting on a saddled horse 400 yards away, and turned it down and said drive. She chose a cell she could be near him in, over a mountain she'd be free on. I have never made a choice like that in my life. I'm not certain I could. Deming, then Las Cruces, then the long haul up to El Paso, and by then it was near the end of June and the wagon was done. I sold it and the mules to a Dutchman for $85, and it took me an hour to walk away from those mules, which is a foolish thing for a grown man to admit, and I'm admitting it. In El Paso, I bought her a hat. That sounds absurd. It was the single most practical thing I did on that entire journey. A plain straw hat, wide, with a scarf, of the kind that half the women in that town wore and nobody looked at twice. She put it on and tied the scarf under her chin, and I stood back and looked. And the truth is that with the hat and the scarf and her head down, she could have been Mexican or Syrian or 100 other things, and would be, for 2,000 miles, to any conductor with 40 other passengers to worry about. She looked at herself in the window glass of a dry goods store for a long moment. "Now I am nobody twice," she said. "Ma'am, if there was another way." "There is not," she adjusted the scarf. "You are not the one who made this. Stop asking me to forgive you for it. It is boring." I laughed out loud in the street. She'd gotten a sense of humor somewhere around New Mexico, and it was the driest thing I ever encountered, and it came out about once a week, and I lived on it. We took a room that night at a place near the depot where the man didn't ask and didn't care. 2 rooms, technically. She slept in a bed for the first time since the fort, and told me the next morning she'd hated it and had ended up on the floor by the window. And in the morning, there was a letter waiting for me at the post office. Tiburcio had done it exactly right. The school's reply had gone to Bowie Station, and he'd opened nothing, and had forwarded it to El Paso General Delivery like we'd arranged, with a note of his own in the same envelope that said only, "The bull is through Sowell's fence again. He is a bull with no sense of danger. You would like him. T.R." I stood on the steps of the post office with the school's envelope in my hand. It was a good envelope, printed corner. Indian Industrial School, Carlisle, pa somebody's clean office, somebody's steel pen. She was across the street in the shade of an awning with the bundle at her feet and the hat on, and she saw my face, and she came across that street through the wagon traffic without looking at any of it. "Open it," she said. "Let's go back to the... Open it here." So I opened it there on the post office steps on the 2nd of July, with a mule cart going by and a dog barking somewhere, and the sun coming off the white caliche so hard it hurt. It was 4 lines long. I read it twice before I said anything, because I wanted the words to be different the second time. "Sir, in reply to yours of the 12th ult., we have no scholar of the name Thomas Cloud upon our rolls, nor any record of such an entry. It is possible you have been misinformed as to the institution. We receive many such inquiries and are unable to trace them. Respectfully, J.N.O., B. Alder, Clerk." She was watching my face. "He is not there," she said. "It says they don't have that name." "Then he is not there." "It says they don't have that name, Naduson. That's not the same. They named him Thomas Cloud in a wagon in about 4 seconds, and there's a dozen of those schools, and every one of them names them different, and clerks get things wrong, and rolls get copied wrong." "Do not," her voice cracked, first time. First and only time in the whole business, and it came out sideways and shook, and she pulled it back in like a woman hauling on a rope. "Do not do to me what the paper did to me. Do not give me a maybe and let me carry it another year." We stood on those steps. There was a fly going around us in the heat. I remember the fly. "I have money for 2 tickets," I said. "I have money for 2 tickets and about 9 days of food and no more than that. If we go east and he's not there, that's it. That's everything. There's no coming back and no trying again." "Yes. And if I take you east and you get picked up in Missouri or Ohio or anywhere between, they will not send you to your son. They will send you to a stockade in Alabama with the rest of them, and I will not be able to stop it, and you will have thrown away that horse in the playas for nothing." "Yes," she said. "The fly, the dog, the white light." She reached up and took the folded paper out from under her blouse and held it in her fist, and I thought she was going to tear it up, and she didn't. She just held it.